Up next is The Haunted Mask 2. So, Steve Boswell, one of the bullies, I guess, from the first book, really wants to be scary because these first graders that he's coaching for the soccer team, he hates them, and they're really terrible kids. Their parents should be ashamed of themselves. Terrible kids, and so he really wants to get revenge on them. So Halloween's coming up, and he really wants to give them a good scare. He goes down to the cellar of the shop where Carly Beth got her mask last year, and he finds a mask. He finds the old man mask that is, on the cover of the book. And then it takes him, honestly, I think more than half of the book to even get it on. So he finally puts the mask on, and then he can't get it off. Carly Beth advises him to find a symbol of love. They try to find a symbol of love, and it doesn't work. And so they say, well, I guess every mask is different. And that, I liked that. That was a very interesting plot point in the book, that all of the masks are removed in a different way. But then we get to the end where we find out how Steve's mask gets removed, and I thought that it was kind of stupid. So Carly and Steve go down to the cellar again, and they find a carton that's full of costumes. And then Carly Beth holds up the costume and says, "Hey, I think this is the one that goes with your mask." And then the mask just kind of floats off, lands on the costume, and dances away. Like, that's really what happens. So it seems like a happy ending until they're confronted by a monster that jumps out of the bushes at them. And it's Chuck, the other bully from the first one. And he's found a mask too. He says, "Hey, I bet you didn't see me grab this mask last time we were in this cellar." And then he says, how do you get this thing off? Do you think you can help me? And then that's the end of the book. I really like that twist ending. It almost makes up for the climactic part of the book where, the mask finally comes off of Steve. I really like that dark ending. Now, this book, it had some noteworthy moments. It has some moments where you really felt for Steve. You really felt sorry for him. You really felt scared for him. But for the most part, there were only a few of them, really. Generally speaking, this book didn't have much suspense to it. It also was quite slow. Once it got going, it was pretty good. It wasn't bad at all. Really, when I was reading this book, I was mostly worried about Noah, Carly Beth's brother. Because if you've read the end of The Haunted Mask, then you're really concerned. Noah, her brother, was only mentioned in The Haunted Mask too, and so that is pretty foreboding, I think. But anyway, it had a lot of promise, but it was just okay. It had enjoyable parts, it had scary parts, and it had the opposite. Not a whole lot to say about this book. It was okay. Now up next is Attack of the Mutant. So Skipper Matthews, he's a comic book enthusiast, loves comic books. He doesn't read them. He just saves them and he keeps them in mint condition in hopes, I guess, that one day they'll be valuable. But he loves The Masked Mutant, and so every time he gets it, he has to read it because it's just the best comic book around. So he's on the bus one day going to the orthodontist. He meets this girl Libby, and this was kind of weird to me, but entertaining as well. Libby asks him, "Hey, where are you going?" And then he says, I don't want to tell her I'm going to the orthodontist. I'll look like a nerd. I'll tell her I'm going to the comic book store." Cuz that's really cool. He's set. He's in the zone. And Libby also just laying it on thick. She's like, "Why don't you come to my house and check out my comic book collection?" Skipper realizes he'd missed his stop on the bus. And then he gets off, and then he sees the Masked Mutants headquarters. He sees the pink building with the green domed roof, and he kind of freaks out. He's like, "I'm going to go inside." After that, it's a little bit, it kind of drags just a little bit. Not much, but a little. Like they walk into there, and then a light scans over Skipper and Libby, and Skipper's like, "Oh, that felt weird. What was that?" So then he finds pictures of the comic books. He's like, "Oh, this must be where they make the comic books." And then he goes and he finds pictures that look like him. He says, "This is me. I'm in the comic book." Then he gets home and gets the special edition of The Masked Mutant, and he reads it and he sees that he's in the comic book. There's the Galloping Gazelle. I guess he's kind of like the Flash. He runs really fast. He's the fastest person in the universe, I think the book called him. He sees the Galloping Gazelle like tied up, and he's like, "Where's that boy? That boy needs to come say," and referring to Skipper. And then Skipper, he has to go back. He says, "Well, I'm going to go back and I'm going to save the gazelle." He goes back and then he finds the gazelle, frees him, and the gazelle is like, "Okay, now we need to defeat the masked mutant." So the masked mutant's superpower is that he can turn into anything solid. And that's an important point in the story, that it has to be something solid. If he turns into a liquid, he can't regenerate himself. If he turns into a gas, he can't regenerate himself. But he can transform into anything, just as long as it's solid. They come across the masked mutant, who was, I think, hiding as a chair or a table or something. And the gazelle is like, "Oh, I know what to do." He starts running around, and then this was so stupid. Galloping Gazelle was running around the mutant, like forming a tornado. Mutant just sticks his foot out, trips him, and then that's it. And then he turns into a jaguar, and then he tries to eat the Galloping Gazelle. And the gazelle's like, "No, I'm out." He just goes away. At that point in the story, Libby came in, and she's got this toy gun. She's like, "This is a molecule disintegration gun. I don't care. It's a comic book. Screw you." She shoots the masked mutant, and he disintegrates. He's like, "Wow, we just defeated the masked mutant." Libby's like, "Did you, though?" Libby was the masked mutant all along. And then the masked mutant says to Skipper, "What's your weakness so that I can kill you?" And then Skipper, thinking fast, he says, "I'm Elastic Boy. You can only defeat Elastic Boy by sulfuric acid." And so the mutant turns into sulfuric acid, but he can't regenerate from being a liquid. And so Skipper has defeated the masked mutant. And then he returns home after that. He starts like cutting up some cake, and he cuts himself. And then he starts bleeding ink, because the light that scanned over him earlier in the book scanned him into the comics, so now he's a comic book character in the real world. And he says, "Get me that edition of The Masked Mutant. I don't think my career in comic books is over." And that's the end of the book. I think that this book is a pretty solid Goosebumps book. It wasn't really that scary. I think that it should have been a little more scary. I think it could have been a little more scary too. I also think this book was really predictable. Like, I think that I could see so much of it coming a mile away. I was able to tell almost immediately that Libby was going to be the mutant in the end. It's not a bad book. It really isn't. It just doesn't really feel like a Goosebumps book. But again, not bad. Now up next is The Curse of Camp Cold Lake. So Sarah goes into Camp Cold Lake, and she hates it. Everything about it, she hates it. The kids there are not treating her very nicely. She's falling victim to all these pranks. And some were pretty vicious pranks, like putting a snake on her. She meets up with her bunkmates, and she's like, "Oh, I can't have this bunk. I want this bunk." And so already she's on the bad terms with the girl whose bunk she stole. I think that was Bianca. She had 3 bunkmates. One doesn't like her because Sarah stole her bunk. There's one girl that doesn't like Sarah because she accidentally spilled like asthma medication. She's like, "Nah, now the whole camp knows. Thanks a lot." And then the third girl doesn't like Sarah because she was seemingly unsympathetic about her weight. And so then they start to pull all sorts of pranks on her, and then nobody likes her. Sarah's brother is turning out to be the sensible one in all this. He's like, oh, hey, calm down. Don't worry about it. And so then she comes up with a plan. She says, well, if I pretend to drown, then everyone's going to feel sorry for me, and then they'll have to respect me just because they'll feel that sorry for me. So she pretends to drown herself, but I guess she accidentally really drowns herself. And so she meets up with this ghost. Her name is Della. And she's like, oh, now you're my buddy. This camp is big on the buddy system. You're my buddy now. And so she's like, oh no. The counselor is able to revive Sarah, and the ghost Della followed her. All sorts of really unnerving stuff happens. Like Della's following her around all these places, evidently trying to kill Sarah so that she can be your buddy forever. Eventually, it gets to a point where Sarah is like, I gotta get away from this camp. So she runs off into the woods, which have been established to be really dangerous to go into those woods. And Della's there waiting for her. She's like, oh, how's it going? And then she's like, why are you in the forest? It's like, I thought that you drowned. She says, no, I didn't drown. I died in these woods. I was bitten by a snake. And so then, there's a snake down there. It's like, you're going to be my buddy forever now. And then Brianna, one of her bunkmates, she comes up afterwards, after this all happens, and then she manages to chase Della away. Then the biggest plot hole in any Goosebumps book ever. This is the biggest plot hole I've come across ever. Brianna says that she died in this forest also, and that Brianna was a ghost all along. Because Sarah runs in to hug Brianna, and her arms go straight through Brianna. And it's like, you're a ghost too. The plot hole is that Sarah has hugged Brianna before in the book. And so she felt Brianna there. Why now can she not? And that is a very big plot hole to me. And I think that without this plot hole, this book, I would rank it higher. But then Brianna's like, oh, I want to be friends forever. And then she's holding the snake. And then that's the end of the book. I would say this book is more creepy than scary. The creepiness of this book is quite far up there after, Sarah tries to drown herself. Before that point, it's not really slow, but it's not really well paced. It's kind of in between there. It's kind of a hard book to rate. Not a very bad read at all. And now up next is Return of the Mummy. So Gabe is back with his Uncle Ben and his cousin Sari. And now there's a new character, Nyla. It's kind of a typical Egypt story to start off. They're in the desert. They see the pyramids. And they go down into the mummy's tomb. They say, hey, we think that we found King Tut's cousin. His name is Prince Koru. They all go down into the tomb. Gabe's Uncle Ben gives Gabe this little amulet. Kind of looks like an amber fossil of a scarab. And so this little fossil, it has the scarab in it, and then Nyla has one just like it, but it does not have the scarab in it. This book kind of is a little bit slow in the middle, and eventually Uncle Ben reveals the words that bring the mummy to life. And so Gabe recites those words just kind of on a whim. He's like, nah, there's no way that can wake the dead. So he just kind of says the words kind of nonchalantly. And then they start seeing weird things. Like Dr. Fielding, who's Uncle Ben's partner, forcing him down into the pyramid. And so then they follow them, and then they see that Prince Koru is alive and that he's walking again. And then in comes Nyla. And she refers to Koru as her brother. The reason why her beetle was missing is because every night she turned into the beetle and crawled into the amulet to preserve herself and to keep herself alive until she could bring back her brother. And now she knew the words, and so that's that. But Prince Koru's one wish was, let me rest in peace. And so he's kind of upset that now he's awake again. He says, just let me rest in peace. But really scary stuff happening with the mummy walking around and like coming after Gabe and Sari and doing all that. Gabe smashes Nyla's amulet, and then the mummy just kind of freezes there, and everything seems to be okay. Everything goes back to normal. Gabe is just laying in his bed, and then he says, "Ouch," and then that's the end of the book. I'm going to start at the ending. I think the ending should have been better. When he says, "Ouch," I think that the ending would have been much better is if he looked down into his amulet and he's like, "Hey, my scarab is missing," and then he says, "Ouch." I think that would be a much more dark ending to this story. I would say this is the mummy story that I wanted from the first one. Like, this is much more of a traditional mummy story. Not to mention that the mummy is given more screen time or page time. It is a little slow to start out with. It does drag for some time in the book, but I think that it was more about just building the suspense and letting it build. So yeah, it was slow, but I think that in a way, the book being slow made it effective. I I liked this book. I enjoyed reading it. Much more of a traditional mummy story, and I really liked that about this book. Next, we have Deep Trouble. The main focus of this book is the mermaid. Now, the book starts and ends with a sea monster, and I really like that. It got my attention right away. The story revolves around Dr. D, Billy, and Sheena, and their grad student who's studying with them named Alexander. They're looking for a mermaid because there have been reports like, hey, there's a mermaid, and these people who work for the zoo say, we want you to catch it for us, and don't worry, we'll take good care of the mermaid and all that, yada, yada, yada. So Billy, he wasn't supposed to know about the mermaid, but he overhears, and so he decides that he's going to go looking for it. And so he's out swimming in the ocean, and he's attacked by a hammerhead shark. Like, the shark actually bites him, and so it gets pretty intense. But then the mermaid runs in to save him, and then when Dr. D sees that the mermaid is there, they catch the mermaid and bring it on board. So then they have the mermaid on board, and then the grad student Alexander, he rounds up a gang, and they come to take the mermaid away. So Alexander and his gang, they take the mermaid away. And so it gets to the point where Alexander locks up Billy, Dr. D, and Sheena in the cage that they had for the mermaid. And so they're locked up in this cage, and then they throw them over the side, and then they realize, like, oh my gosh, we're going to drown. But then there's this actually pretty intense scene of the bunch of mermaids that are grouping up and fighting back. And so these mermaids rescue Billy, Sheena, and Dr. D, and then they go after Alexander, and they free the other mermaid, and then happy ending for everybody. The mermaids go free, they don't get turned over to the zoo. And then, twist ending of the book, the sea monster from the beginning strikes again. And then that's the end of the book. This book is pretty good. I like this book actually a lot more than I thought that I would. It's pretty well paced, it has pretty good characters. I kind of do wish that it had a little more horror to it. Like maybe the sea monster played a bigger role. But the story, it was fine. And honestly, it was quite enjoyable.